Today, I'd like to move on to the modern-day hypothesis of the authorship of the Pentateuch. As we saw the previous class, there were already doubts on Moses' authorship. From the 18th century onward, the modern Old Testament scholars presented several different hypotheses about how the Pentateuch had the final form as it is now. Today, I try to introduce three different hypotheses, but the final documentary hypothesis became the predominant hypothesis in the Old Testament scholarship. The first hypothesis was fragmentary hypothesis. Another name for this fragmentary hypothesis is a cycle or block model. According to fragmentary hypothesis, this theory was claimed by, for example, scholars such as Alexander Giddis or Johann Severin Fata. According to fragmentary hypothesis, they claimed the Pentateuch consisted of all different kinds of fragments. Story 1 fragment and story 2 fragments, story 3 and 4 and 6. So all different fragments came together and make a big Pentateuch. So one author, one editor made up all the different stories, and now we have a Pentateuch. So Pentateuch, according to fragmentary hypothesis, basically was a collection of all different stories. The second hypothesis was supplementary hypothesis. Another name for this hypothesis is expansion of a basic text model. This hypothesis is a total opposite way of understanding the structure of the Pentateuch to the fragmentary hypothesis. Okay, according to supplementary hypothesis, of which proponents were scholars like Evart or De Wette, Pentateuch basically came from a small regional story. That small story was expanded by story number 2 and another story like story number 3 and story number 4 and so forth. Finally, the expanded stories came into the present form of the Pentateuch. According to scholars like Evart or De Wette, the original story, they conjecture might be the Exodus chapters 21 through 23, and then the second story was added up to the original story number 1. The stories number 2 may be Elohim materials, and number 3 stories may be Yahweh materials, and finally Deuteronomy stories were added up with all the previous stories, and finally we have now the Pentateuch as the final form. The final hypothesis is documentary hypothesis. Another name for this hypothesis is source criticism. This hypothesis actually still influential even today, so we should know this hypothesis. Okay, the last hypothesis is documentary hypothesis. Documentary hypothesis' primary claim is that at least 4 different sources were behind the Pentateuch. So, for example, J, E, or D, or P, those sources were behind the Pentateuch. So it's not like the fragmentary hypothesis or supplementary hypothesis. This documentary hypothesis believes that there were different documents behind the Pentateuch. So these different documents made up one big collection that is the Pentateuch. The primary scholar who claimed for documentary hypothesis was Julius Wellhausen. You should know this name. Um, According to Julius Wellhausen, here the J source uh, was written most earlier. Then we have E source. Sometime in history, J source and E source combined together, and later then D source came into being, and then later in time, P source appeared in history, and redactor, R represents redactor, combined JE, the earlier source, and then D and P all together, and later in time, we have a Torah finally. So this is the basic theory of documentary hypothesis. We will see more detail each of these documents. Okay, now let's look at 4 different sources, more detail, which Wellhausen claimed for. First of all, the J source. J actually coming from the Yahweh in German, because Yahweh begins with a J in German. So he put the name J source here. So Yahweh is the source, calls God with the name Yahweh in Hebrew. In Korean translation, we say Yehovah. And this J source literary character is more like a vivid narrative, and the J source takes up 50% of Genesis down to Exodus 24 and parts of Numbers. The most representative J source is Genesis 2, 4b verse down to chapter 3 verse 24. And the second source, E source, comes from the name Elohist, because in this Elohist source, God is called the name Elohim in Hebrew. A Korean translation we say Hananim. So basically, Yahweh and Elohim are 2 different Hebrew names. And also this Elohist source has more vivid narrative literary style. And about 33% of Genesis to Exodus 24 are coming from the Elohist source. And also little parts of the Numbers. And the third source is D source. D source name comes from Deuteronomy, and he put the name Deuteronomist because he's the writer of the Deuteronomy. So he says this is a Deuteronomist. Okay, and according to D source, Yahweh, or it's just like a J source here. So Yahweh is the name for the divine being. And these Deuteronomist literary style is more like a sermonic. So he loves sermon. And Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy is the representative Deuteronomist source. And the last one is P source. P source name comes from the priestly, okay? And also here in P source, God is called the name Elohim, just like E source up here, okay? And the P's the writing style is more like a list and dates and religious issues and the laws on worship and etc. Okay, and 17% of Genesis to Exodus 25 to Numbers 36. So basically the priestly source is sporadic throughout the Pentateuch. So the Berghausen, he tries to say at least four different kinds of sources, J, E, D, and P. But here's more like the uh, chronologically, J source came into being much, much earlier than E, and then we have a D, and finally P. So these points are different from the fragments hypothesis, because according to fragmentary hypothesis, almost the same era, different stories, here and there, and one editor tried to collect all different stories. But according to Wellhausen, this source criticism is more like one stories came earlier than the other stories. So the final editor, he collected all different sources which were produced in different times. So that's the different point from fragmentary hypothesis. Do you understand what I'm saying here? Okay. If you have any question, then leave your question, all right, on the the Q&A section on the Cyber Campus. Okay. Let's move on to the next page. Okay. So J document, J was written about 950 BCE. This is the time of King David and Solomon by an unknown writer in the southern kingdom of Judah. And J uses Yahweh for God's name. And J often refers to God anthropomorphically. That means like, they try to portray God like a human being. So God, you know, talking freely with the human beings. And so the older story is more like in all the stories, God behaves like a human being. Okay. And J makes about half of Genesis, the first half of Exodus, and some parts of Numbers. So according to Wellhausen, J takes up the most of the Pentateuch. And then E document, E was written about 850 BCE by unknown writer in the northern kingdom of Israel. And E dwells on concrete particulars and is interested in ritual worship. God communicates through dreams rather than walking and talking with men. So the walking and talking with men, this literary style reflects a J style, okay, rather than the E style. E uses Elohim, so the name E, Elohim, Elohist, coming from the divine name in this source. E makes up about a third of Genesis, half of Exodus, and some portions of Numbers. Okay, so sometime in history, J and E were combined in circa 750 BCE by an unknown redactor. This redactor combined J and E into a single document. So again, I want to say this documentary hypothesis is different from fragmentary hypothesis because fragmentary hypothesis believes all the different stories, the stories of number one, stories number two, and so forth. All the stories are almost in the contemporary situation, but the documentary hypothesis believes that the sources came into being in different times. So the J source came into being earlier, then we have a E source, then later J and the E combined together by a redactor. We don't know the redactor's name. So this is the theory of documentary hypothesis. So you guys need to differentiate documentary hypothesis from the fragmentary hypothesis. And the third source is the D document. D, as I told you already, the name D comes from the book name Deuteronomy, and the writer of Deuteronomy we call Deuteronomist. Okay, D document basically is a law book. This is Wellhausen's theory. So a law book was found during the time of a temple was in repair. This book increased King Josiah's reforms. Josiah's reform was done to force people to stop worshiping in high places and worship only in Jerusalem. Wilhelm de Wette claimed that the law book uh, found in the temple was a pious fraud to provide the legal basis for Josiah's reform. This means, I think I need to explain this situation a little bit uh, because you are now familiar with the biblical stories. Okay, there was a king named King Josiah in the history of Israel. Okay, he became a king at his very early age. When he became a at 20, he became 20. He tried to repair the temple, Jerusalem temple, because when he was 20, the Jerusalem temple was more than 400 years old, very old building. So he tried to repair the temple building. While he was repairing the Jerusalem temple, he found a law book. So he opened the law book, and then he found if you don't observe the law of God, then you will be cursed. So these contents um, are in that law book. So King Josiah tried to say we should follow the law book's commandment. So he tried to eradicate all the high places and the idol worships in throughout the land of Israel. So he tried to make a big religious reformation. So we say this is Josiah's reform. Do you understand what's going on here? So this is the historical story that we can read in the book of Kings. But Wilhelm de Bette, this German scholar, says this is all nothing but the pious fraud. Why? Because he says, um, King Josiah reported that I found a law book while repairing the Jerusalem temple. This is just nothing but the lie, because he tried to drive Jerusalem temple, and he tried to drive the people to worship only in Jerusalem. So he tried to eradicate all the different the worshiping places throughout the land of Israel. So he tried to centralize the worshiping place only in Jerusalem. Then he needed some kind of ideological support uh, book, or something to drive and something to support his religious reform. So he said, see, I found the law book when I was repairing the Jerusalem temple, and look at the law book, and I found the verses like, if you don't preserve, if you don't keep the divine law, then we all be cursed, and we all even be carried away from our own land. So he tried to drive the people. So the Wilhelm de Wette says this is nothing but the pious fraud, 경건한 사기극이라고 이야기를 했습니다. Okay. Anyhow, the D source contains almost all Deuteronomy and also Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. When we study the book of Deuteronomy, then I will come back to the D source and the academic, the scholarly discussions. Okay, more in detail. And in the D source, D uses Yahweh, the Hebrew word Yahweh, when they call God. The last source of Wellhausen is P document, the priestly document. P composed in various stages all the way from Ezekiel with his holiness code circa 570 CE to the time of Ezra. So anyhow, this is the last document out of four documents. So priestly document is concerned with a systematic account of the origins and institutions of the Israelite theocracy. It shows a particular interest in origins, in genealogical lists, and details of sacrifice and ritual. Priestly source makes up a fifth of Genesis, large portions of Exodus and the Numbers, and nearly all of Leviticus. Priestly source uses Elohim for God up to Exodus chapter 6 verses 2 to 3. Okay, this diagram shows four different sources in chronological order. Um, According to Wellhausen, J and E sources were written in around the time of King David and Solomon. And sometime in history, J and E sources got together. And later in the time of King Josiah, the Deuteronomy source was created. And then finally, the priestly source was created in the time of Persian Empire. So in history of Israel, under the leadership of Joshua, Israelite people came into the land of Canaan, so they have optimism. And then they have kings such as Saul, David, and Solomon. So they celebrated their entry and their establishment of a dynasty. But at the same time, Israelite people, they protested against Yahweh by, for example, worshiping idols um, like Baal and Ishtaroth. But in the time of King Josiah, he tried to make a religious reform and make a reassurance of divine favor and grace toward the Israelite people. But Kingdom of Judah was, conquered by Babylonian Empire, and they carried away to Babylonian Empire. But in the time of Persia, the Israelite people, they returned back to their homeland. So they had a hope again, even though it was really difficult times, but they had a hope again because they came back to their own land. So throughout the Israelite history, they had a different the written documents. They wrote their own history in different times. So the Pentateuch basically collected throughout the history. So it took a long time to have the final form of the Pentateuch. This is the basic theory of Wellhausen's documentary hypothesis. Okay, um, after Wellhausen's documentary hypothesis, scholars try to make adjustments to documentary hypothesis. Uh, Martin note, he had a question. Okay, I accepted Wellhausen's theory of documentary hypothesis. So he accepted J, Yahwist sources, and E, Elohist sources. He accepted his basic, Wellhausen's basic idea. But he had a question. Um, what was uh, lying even before J and E sources? What was there even before J or E sources? Because the Yahwist, the writer of J or Elohist, the writer of Elohim, they should have something else to write their own documents. So he had a question about these very the fundamental original sources. He had a question about this stage. So he put the name Grundlage in German. Grund means ground. Lage means lay down. So the basic, very ground line sources. He had a question about the fundamental sources for both J and E. And Gerhard von Rath, he tried to answer about this previous stage. He said there was cradle. Cradle means the, the proclamation of the belief. So, according to von Rath, cradle we can find in Deuteronomy chapter 26, 5 to 9. So he says here we have a very fundamental source for both Yahwist and Elohist sources. So they had a question about this stage way before the written documents of J and E sources. So the von Rath, he said, and also Martin Noth, they said, here in this previous very early stage, this stage may be the oral tradition, because the J and the E both were documents, written documents, but before J and the E, the Jewish people, they had their stories, mouth to mouth. So we say this is the oral tradition. Okay, so the Martin Noth and the von Rath, they say the Israelite people, ancient Israelite people, they had an oral tradition way before they wrote down their stories in documents such as J and E. These days, modern scholars are more concerned with the final form rather than on the behind the scene. So far, we looking the scholars' works. They trying to dig uh, behind the Pentateuch. So, what kind of sources were there? How the Pentateuch made up the final form. So they try to look at the behind the final form. But these days, modern scholars, we try to look at the final form as it is in our hand. So there, and also the technically we have difficulties because we have difficulties in separating between J and E, because J and E, the Wellhausen, he tried to separate between J and E basically by the divine names, Yahweh or Elohim. But in some biblical passages, we can find Jehovah, Yahweh and Elohim used at the same time, side by the side. So it's really difficult to separate J and E. And also, some scholars, they try to point out the repetition and stylistic variation. Um, these kind of the literary styles are very different from our modern way of writing literature. But this repetition, doubling, or variation, opposition, conflicts within the same literature, it's just to reflect the the different kind of literary device of ancient scholar. Uh, we cannot say this, the repetition and different types of writing styles came from all different writers. Wellhausen, he said, if we find the different, the, you know, the different variations or repetitions, and he says that this coming from different hands. So whether it may be J or E or D or P, but these days, modern scholars says, even though we have some kind of conflicts or repetitions, it all came from uh, one one author. For example, we even you know we as an individual person, we writing romance letter, and sometimes we can write a newspaper style report, and sometimes we write academic paper, and sometimes we write a song. So we are one person as an individual, but we have a very different writing styles for different purposes. So this is just a literary device. It doesn't reflect uh, saying uh, all different literary styles coming from all different authors. So these days we have a different opinions. So this is all um, the academic efforts or attempts to understand the compositional history of the Pentateuch. So today we've studied the three different hypotheses. These hypotheses basically try to explain the compositional history of the Pentateuch, how the Pentateuch was written, how the Pentateuch came into being as it is now. So some scholars, they try to explain the composition of the Pentateuch with the fragmentary hypothesis. So all different fragments in the contemporary times, all the different stories came together by one editor. And second, supplementary hypothesis. This hypothesis tried to say there was one small original piece. That small little part was expanded by story after stories. Then we have one big Pentateuch. And final hypothesis, documentary hypothesis, or we say source criticism. Documentary hypothesis says at least four different sources, J, E, D, and P, were behind the Pentateuch. So these four different sources came from four different writers in different times. So far we have three hypotheses, but the number three, documentary hypothesis, source criticism, has become the predominant theory of the Old Testament scholarship for the composition of the Pentateuch. Next time, we move on to the book of Genesis. So we try to look at the Pentateuch. Thank you for listening.